Mike Gravel mentions that if he becomes president, he's going to nominate you as a justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he's a lovely fellow, but that was the moment at which I decided I couldn't support his candidacy. A lovely, lovely person, though.
Did you know that was coming? Did they give you in advance?
No, not at all. And I think happily for the Republic, he didn't really stand a great chance of ever being elected. But as I said, I do think he's a very thoughtful and person. But that I think it was just a moment of exuberance, over-exuberance on his part.
What does a Robert Jackson mean to a Professor Amar?
He's this very interesting transitional figure. He himself was not a law clerk, but his own law clerks. But he did have law clerks, and one of them became Chief Justice, and one of that, William Rehnquist, and one of that person's law clerks again became Chief Justice, John Roberts. So he's this very interesting transitional figure. He emerged from a world in which you didn't have to have gone to a fancy law school, you didn't have to have clerked to be on the Supreme Court. But today, many of the people who are on the Supreme Court or have been on the Supreme Court since Jackson have gone to fancy law schools and have done fancy clerkships. And interestingly, they have connections to Robert Jackson, like William Rehnquist, who went to Stanford Law School and was Jackson's own clerk, or like John Roberts, who went to Harvard Law School and who clerked for Rehnquist, who, to repeat in turn, clerked for Jackson.
When you were at Yale, did Jackson was he much read? Was he a conversation or not? I mean, do you have a recollection that you have the Frankfurters, the Blacks, the Douglases? Was Jackson in that conversation?
My colleague Bruce Ackerman has paid great attention to Jackson's work even before he was a justice, to his critique of the old court. He wrote a book about judicial supremacy that Ackerman cites in great detail. I personally have found John Barrett's work so fascinating on Jackson, and my student and friend Noah Feldman wrote a very interesting book about the Jackson era on the Supreme Court. I have read a lot of work of Dennis Hutchinson and others about that court. By acclamation, I think Jackson does rank among the justices generally reckoned great. And there was a recent list just last month by Cass Sunstein, who's among the, I think he may even be the single most cited legal academic. I think he probably is the single most cited legal academic today. And he came up with his list of the 8 greatest justices of all time, and Jackson was on that list. And see, Cass is a Harvard Law product himself. I think 4 of the 8 were Harvard Law School graduates: Holmes, Brandeis, Brennan, and Frankfurter. And so the only 4 who weren't. So 4 were Harvard people. Earl Warren was a 5th, and John Marshall was a 6th. So that only leaves 2, non-Harvard, non-Earl Warren, non-chiefs that it could be actually. And the other one was a chief, William Rehnquist. So 4 were Harvard, 3 were chiefs. Jackson from the get-go isn't Harvard Law School and isn't a chief, so he got the only slot that wasn't Harvard and wasn't a chief in Cass Sunstein's list. So can't do much better than that.
You've been cited about 20 times by the Supreme Court. When you read your name in there, what's that do for you?
It's a reminder that I need to be serious, because lawyers and judges might rely on this work. It's a special thrill to me when I remember that I'm being cited sometimes by the conservatives and sometimes by the liberals, and sometimes actually by both in the same case. City of Chicago versus McDonald, actually both the liberals and the conservatives cited me in a hot button gun control issue. I like the fact that actually my citations cover different parts of my scholarship. It's not the same book or article every time. Sometimes it's in criminal procedure, sometimes it's in structural constitutional law, sometimes it's in individual rights not having to do with criminal procedure. So it's just a nice positive reinforcement, because here's the truth about being an academic. It's a kind of lonely job. You're in the classroom, you're engaging your students, and that's great, but that's a few hours a week. The rest of the time, you're basically living in your own head. You're sitting in your office and you're reading books and articles and sitting at the keyboard and writing stuff. And you have no idea if there's anyone out there listening. It's like stuffing little messages in bottles and throwing them out, on Lake Chautauqua or the ocean, and you never know if these bottles are washing up on any distant shore and if someone is uncorking them and reading what's inside. So it's, for me, it's actually, truthfully, very gratifying to know that there actually are people reading it and paying attention to it.
We have an exhibit at the Jackson Center, and if I hope time permits, so you'll get to see that, but it's Jackson's teacher at high school, Mary Willard, who had a tremendous influence on him and ultimately shaped him, and he was the first to admit it. Was there somebody who shaped you? Was there a role model?
Yes, my parents, of course, but in this new book that I have coming out, there are two people who are specially mentioned. One is my high school journalism teacher, Ruth Ann White, and the other is my scoutmaster, Ken Harmon. And Ruth Ann White stood by me when my columns for the high school newspaper were censored by our principal, and so I learned a lot about the First Amendment and that experience, and as I said, she stood by me, and that's when I think first got serious about freedom of speech and of the press. I think a junior in high school at the time, maybe a sophomore. And Ken Harmon, my scoutmaster, taught me a lot about guns, taught me about respect for firearms. I don't have one myself, but he taught me a lot about the Second Amendment. And so they are both very prominently mentioned in this new book as real mentors, role models.
You also had a year where you were clerking with now Justice Breyer. What impact did he have on you?
He was he was the nicest boss in the world. He has. I wanted to clerk for a young judge because I wanted someone who would be a mentor for many years to give me career advice over the years, and he has done that because he was very young when I applied to him. I have very expensive taste. I applied to, I think, only 11 people, but by expensive I mean I picked people who had reputations of being really brilliant judges still on the rise. One of them was Tony Kennedy on the Ninth Circuit. One of them was Steve Breyer on the First Circuit. I didn't want to be in D.C. Otherwise I would have applied to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Those were the only three judges who at that time who went on to become justices. So very expensive taste. I aimed high, and I wasn't ideological. I knew that Kennedy was a Republican appointee and Breyer a Democrat appointee, but my friends told me they're smart and honest judges, and they both have been role models for me. Interestingly, both Northern Californian, as am I. Steve Breyer, since I mentioned my scoutmaster, was an Eagle Scout. So was I, and I think that may have helped me get the job, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much.